Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Someone to Tell It To podcast. Always good to have you with us. So we wanted to acknowledge something. Yesterday here in the United States was Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It is always observed on the third Monday of January each year. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15th, 1929. He was a pivotal advocate for African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. King experienced racism from an early age, and those events stayed with him and eventually brought him to a life of activism. After graduating college with a doctorate degree in theology, King became a pastor in Alabama. He began a series of peaceful protests in the South that eventually changed many laws dealing with equality of African Americans. King gave hundreds of moving speeches across the country, and in 1964 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was shot and killed while in Memphis, Tennessee. Although his life ended that day, the work that he had accomplished changed the nation. King will be remembered not only for his commitment to the cause of equality for African Americans, but also for his profound speeches that moved so many. MLK Jr.'s words were spoken with hope that the future for African Americans would be brighter and that they would finally be given the equality they deserved.
We won't challenge you to remember the words and life of Dr. King today, because we believe that we should all take his radical ideas of peace, justice, and equality to heart every day of the year. Dr. King is quoted as saying, an individual has not started living until he or she can rise above the narrow confines of their individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Dr. King was a man of action, and we can bring that action into our lives every day simply by lifting each other up and challenging inequality and hatred wherever we see it. Today's conversation is about another topic: action, equality, and justice for all. A topic we are all working through ourselves with our team at Someone to Tell It To, and communicating with the larger beloved community of which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referenced. And that topic is belonging. In this conversation, our guest, Sarah Judd Welch, who has been researching this subject for an extensive period of time, defines for us what belonging is, what it isn't, and how to foster it in our own spheres of influence. Sarah Judd Welch, she, her, of New York City and Brooklyn to be exact, believes that it is our collective responsibility to create environments and cultures in which everyone is seen, heard, and valued. When each of us belongs, we can transform together. As an organizational and community designer, she leads Sharehold, which is an innovation consultancy that designs and fosters belonging with teams of communities. Most recently, she led Redesigning Belonging: How Uncertainty Magnifies Belonging at Work, a research report and workbook that explores how uncertainty impacts one's sense of belonging at work, uncovers a methodology for assessing belonging, and facilitates conversations to develop a company's unique belonging strategy. Sarah is Dare to Lead trained in bringing sociologist, researcher, and best-selling author Brené Brown's research on shame, vulnerability, and empathy into practice within teams. And we welcome Sarah to the Someone to Tell It To podcast today.
Well, Sarah, it's so good to have you in this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom and Michael. I'm so grateful that you reached out and that we could be here today.
So one of the things, as I was working my way through your biography on your site, it says that your current obsessions, we love this, include gardening, watercoloring, and being present. The second two make perfect sense, but how do you garden in New York City? We're
Um,
curious.
well, in 2016, I was taking a break from work and I just needed to do something that was not at my computer. So I built a garden on my partner's deck. And a few years later, when we split up and I moved out, my number one priority in finding a new apartment in Brooklyn was having garden space. So I made it happen. I like moved to a different neighborhood where I could like get more space for cheaper, and I built a big garden on my back deck. So in the summertime, I grow tomatoes, cucumbers, a few different varietals of each, kale, eggplant, squash, roses, you name it.
Good for you.
I
Wow.
really enjoy it. If you ever need to do something super meditative and something that anchors you to the world when it's chaotic like it is right now, highly recommend gardening.
Both of us
Yeah.
are active gardeners ourselves. In fact,
Really?
I last night had we can a ton of sauce and salsa,
Oh,
cucumbers,
amazing.
all kinds of things. So Michael has a garden at his house, and I have a garden. Actually, it's not actually on my property. My wife's Nana, she allows me to have a huge plot on her property, so it's pretty close, and it's a win-win because I'm able to help her out in caring for her own garden, and and then we do a lot of canning in the off season. So actually, now's a nice time of the year. A lot of people don't like this time of the winter as much, but we sometimes like to slow down a bit because all fall we spend canning almost every weekend preparing for the winter.
That's amazing. I
Yeah.
haven't quite reached the canning phase of gardening, but I aspire to. So I might tap you at some point in time to learn more about how to get started.
Anytime.
Yeah, and one of the I don't know favorite things is in the spring when the garden is start again, and deciding what to plant and being able to plant it, and when it looks really good before the weeds come in, and
Yeah.
and all the other things like that that suddenly becomes difficult. But it's really fun to do. It is meditative. It's relaxing, and it's just wonderful to see stuff grow and sprout. And sadly, this year for me, my garden did not do well. This past year did not do it as well, and
Mine
I'm not
neither.
exactly sure why.
Because 2020, we can just blame it
Yeah,
on
it's
the
just
year.
it's just exactly it was just the whole year, So the tomatoes, they were nice, but not as many as we've had before. The eggplant never blossomed, never did anything. They produced nothing. The varieties of peppers, different colored peppers, which I like to virtually nothing. It was incredible how things didn't just die or anything, but they didn't produce.
It's amazing how it
Maybe the
works 'cause
plants were feeling the existential stress of 2020
exactly.
trauma responses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, so let's get into talking a little bit about your work today. One of the things we've enjoyed doing is just spending more time getting to know you and about you. But even before we do that today, one of the things we've been doing with all of our guests in 2020, but also now in 2021, is just talking a little bit about the pandemic and how it's affected you personally and professionally. And maybe you could just do as all of our guests have, share one silver lining that you've seen through the pandemic, and then maybe one of the most challenging things that you've had to work through.
Yeah, I love that you asked this question. I think one of the big silver linings for me is the opportunity to slow down and be a lot more present and evaluative, and like just even speaking to what we were saying just a moment ago about gardening, like actually noticing the flowers blooming
Mm.
and watching it change day by day, whereas before I simply wasn't around enough or present enough or aware enough to really see that process happening. Like I can remember in March, April, walking around New York City in the thick of the pandemic before we really knew what was going on, like going on a daily walk and just being absolutely stunned by the blossoms on trees. There's a lot of cherry blossoms in my neighborhood in Bed-Stuy and magnolias, and just like watching the flowers open in the thick of the pandemic where there's so much death around you, but yet trees still bloom. was absolutely mind-blowing to me and just like very beautiful and cathartic. So that was definitely a silver lining, is just to witness that and to be fully present for it. And then of course, beyond that, while we're all sheltered at home and sheltering in place, I've started calling my friends on the phone, which never happened really before the pandemic. We might schedule a phone call or text back and forth, but now we just call each other while we're like grabbing lunch or like cleaning our apartments. And that has been so, so lovely. And I think that's a habit that I want to stay with me for the rest of my life. And I feel so silly saying that, because I know that like our parents do that, like maybe even you do that. But I feel like that was never something that was never a habit that I had before the pandemic. And I'm super grateful for that. And then in terms of challenges, I think it's, the existentialism that everyone's facing, way too much evaluative time on your hands. It's like the excess of being present. So there can be too much.
Well, I ask a question about what, living in New York City, which was for a while such an epicenter of the coronavirus and the pandemic. And talk a little bit about what that was like. Was that a frightening time for you? How isolated were you? What did it feel like?
It was definitely a very fearful time, because at that point in time, we didn't really know what was happening. We didn't know how COVID spread. I can remember at one point in time, like I belong to my neighborhood CSA, which is where I get most of my produce when I'm not growing things in my garden. And I can remember the first time after the shelter in place orders went into effect, I had to like gear up to go out to pick up my produce box. And like I put on like dish gloves, and then I put on like a t-shirt mask, but I didn't have a mask yet. And like everyone was so scared to like walk past each other on the sidewalk, because like we just didn't know how COVID spread at that point. Like people are saying 6 feet, but like people were taking it very, very seriously. And people were just scared to be around each other. So it was a very fearful time in New York. And then of course, in April, there was just like this overwhelming silence in the city, of a lack of activity, no street traffic, which is super unusual in New York. And then there was several weeks where it was just siren after siren after siren of ambulances picking people up and taking them to the hospital. And it was just really heartbreaking. Like it was very, very, very sobering. I've never seen a city like that.
I mean, as a follow-up to that, have you been able to take some time to grieve and to process that? Are you still grieving? I mean, grief is an ongoing journey, as we all know and have experienced, but
I mean, yes and no. Like I want to say yes, but I have the feeling that it'll come to me in moments down the line of, like months later, after this is all said and done and we're going back to our normal lives, of it just like hitting me. I can imagine that happening. I certainly tried to take it a little bit easier this year with work and, really take care of myself and prioritize mental health. But that's not necessarily the same thing as like processing and grieving. Yeah.
well, you mentioned your work, so let's talk a little bit about that. And thanks for your vulnerability today.
Of course. Thank you.
So for those of you tuning in today, we got connected with Sarah through another mutual connection of ours, one of our former guests in season 3, loneliness researcher Casley Killam. And every Wednesday, Casley around the noon hour on the West Coast was where she's from. If you remember, she did that interview from her bathroom, which we all laughed about, in San Francisco, does a live Instagram conversation, probably not from her bathroom though, with people in a related field of study, as well as practitioners. And one of those conversations was with Sarah. And immediately afterwards, we messaged Sarah to ask if she would join us, as her work seems to deeply connect with our work at Someone to Tell It To. Particularly, one statement stood out to us, where you said, "I believe that it is our collective responsibility to create environments and cultures in which everyone is seen, heard, and valued. When each of us belongs, we can transform together." Just love that. Mm-hmm. So for many of our listeners who aren't familiar with you or your work, would you tell us just a little bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you into this field? Take us back to that moment or moments when you knew this was something you needed to invest your time and energy into?
And that's a really meaty question. I would
Yes, it
describe
is.
myself as a community designer and an organizational designer, which sometimes people are like, what does that mean? It's really research and strategy to bring together groups of people, whether that's in a community or within a team. So my work is very applicable to any sort of group dynamic or bringing people together, building together. I've had a pretty windy career path. This is certainly not the work that I ever thought that I'd be doing, though I'm pretty happy that it has ended up here and brought me here. I thought that I was going to have a career in politics. When I was, in high school, I thought that I would like start some sort of social services nonprofit. And then I quickly figured out that I really wanted to do something that was solutions oriented. I think that's really important in my work, is that I really love to help solve problems and identify solutions and move them forward, not just like put band-aids on things. So I worked on Hillary Clinton's Senate '06 campaign. I worked with a nonprofit to help candidates run for local office in New York City. I actually was elected to a local seat in an election district myself when I was 21. And then it came time to graduate from college, and I was like, oh no, I have student loans. Like, I can't actually afford this. So I quickly was like, I need to figure out something else. And around that time, the market was crashing. I went to NYU's Career Center and I was like, what do I do? I have all this like really interesting experience, but I can't pursue this path. It's not realistic for me. And they're like, well, Goldman Sachs is going to be on campus next week. You should go talk to them. And I was like, what's Goldman? And like, lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, I had a job offer from Goldman, still not really knowing what Goldman did. And it was also the only job offer that I got. So even though in this discovery process, I was realizing, Goldman is not a place that I actually want to work, I felt pretty pressured into taking that offer, since it was the only opportunity that was standing in front of me. And I was looking at a pile of student loan debt. So I took this job. I stayed for 2 years. I ended up working in tech afterwards with companies like Catch-A-Fire and TaskRabbit, really focusing on realigning my work with more of a mission-driven focus. I really wanted to reroute into my values. But also in my time at Goldman, I realized that I was very effective in the private sector, and I really loved business. Like, I love the ability to build things, ship them, move them forward. And I love the speed of business as compared to the speed of politics. So I determined at that point in time, after leaving Goldman, that I wanted to stay in the private sector, but I wanted to do work that was much more meaningful. So I worked with different companies in tech and started finding these really interesting opportunities. I started freelancing. And when I was freelancing, this was back in like 2011, 2012, and I was just taking the work that was available to me, but also trying to really, again, pursue work that was values aligned with me. And I kept coming up against these projects, or being invited into these projects that were very community oriented, community driven, customer centric, really about understanding what it is that people need and then how to solve that problem. So that period of time in that series of freelance work resulted in me starting my first company, Loyal, which was a consulting firm that focused specifically on community design, development, and strategy. And through Loyal, I worked with all different kinds of companies, ranging from Grammarly and Google, 100K and 10, AARP, National Geographic, all different kinds of organizations across sectors on community development and strategy. And it was a really fulfilling period of time, though I did face a turning point eventually. And I remember earlier I mentioned that I was taking a break from work back in like 2016, and I started gardening. This was around that period of time. I was starting to realize the limitations of our community design and development work. And I felt like we were doing really powerful, amazing work, but we couldn't quite affect the change that we wanted to see. And we started to see that in order for our work to be as effective and impactful as possible on behalf of customers, users, community members, stakeholders, that we needed to begin to shift our focus to organizational change. That community change in itself was not possible unless organizations were also transforming. And oftentimes the key to community-driven change is organizational change, and then beyond that, personal change as well. And this was really well embodied with our work with the American Medical Association, which came later in 2017, 2018, where we were working with them to help reimagine the physician experience and how the American Medical Association is in relationship with its physician members. And we saw that in order for the American Medical Association to be in deep membership and community with their physicians, they needed to change how they internally operated as a company. So we worked really closely with Todd Unger, who's their Chief Experience Officer, to reimagine both what physician engagement looks like and membership, and then how that was reflected back internally inside the company in terms of how they allocated resources, how they structure their team, what internal capacities needed to develop, and why. And ultimately, after that project, I took a step back and I was like, you know what? I think there's something here. And the way that we've packaged and positioned Loyal as a community design, development, and strategy consulting firm isn't as, this isn't like the right package or the right sandbox, so to speak. Like, we have outgrown the sandbox that we built. So then I created Sharehold. And Sharehold is an innovation and consulting firm that works with communities and teams to design belonging for change. Majority of our clients are going through significant periods of transformation. Either they've launched something that has been extremely successful, perhaps they launched something and experienced failure and need to figure out how to turn it around, or they're just at the crossroads of uncertainty and are unsure where to go next. But what brings our clients together is that they do want to bring both their community and external stakeholders, their customers, together with their team and their internal stakeholders, which might include employees, board members, perhaps funders, or foundations, and bring them all around a shared strategy and help them move forward and transform together. So it's really about inclusive stakeholder models, mutuality, co-ownership, participation, and an embodiment of values in business, and really bringing together this idea that shareholding is not reserved for purely financial stakeholders, but is an active value and process that can be applicable for any stakeholder within a business context to develop new solutions and programs and products.
You talk about and write about belonging in in the midst of all of this. And so before we go any further, we want to ask you, could you describe what it means to belong, what belonging is, and what it's not, and maybe a few examples from the work that you've done, from your research and experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. It's part of the reason why Sharehold began researching belonging, is because there's not a very strong consensus about what belonging means. There's a few different narratives that exist in our culture about what is belonging. And when you talk to one person versus another, they might describe it differently. And even in our own initial research, we saw that people were talking about belonging in different ways. And that was a really big reason why we started researching belonging. I mean, as a culture, we've been talking about belonging for probably half a century, even longer, 70 years or so. In Sharehold's research, when we talk about belonging, we are referring to the definition that was developed by researchers Dr. Bonnie M. Haggerty and Dr. Kathleen Petusky. And they define belonging as two specific attributes. One is valued involvement, the experience of being seen, valued, and needed and accepted for who you are. And two, fit, the perceived, quote unquote, fitting in or identifying with the groups or systems characteristics and needs. I will say that more recently in culture, there's been a pushback against this attribute of fitting in. I think that this attribute is largely misunderstood. People think of it as conformity, but it could be something as simple as, my team needs data science skills and you have data science skills, therefore your skills fit in here. It could be something much more superficial, though sometimes it is perceived as being more conformist, and it's really, that's not necessarily true. This definition developed by Bonnie M. Haggerty it's a little bit in contrast to Brene Brown's definition of belonging. Brene Brown talks about the concept of true belonging, which is the idea of self-acceptance, that you only belong as much as you belong to yourself. We found in our research at Sharehold on belonging at work in a time of uncertainty that definition of true belonging or that state of true belonging, I would say, is very much of an aspiration, but not necessarily a reality for many people, particularly when it comes to people's place of work. Especially for those with any kind of marginalized identity, particularly BIPOC. Belonging is inherently a relational concept, and self-acceptance and your self-belonging will only take you so far in regards to the group, particularly when it comes to your work environment. So it's very much like an aspiration. I have so many opinions on that, but I will save that for later in our conversation. And then also I would say a third way that people talk about belonging is purely in regards to a group aspect. So it's all about how do you belong within a group of people? And what we found in our research is that there's something a little bit in between those two concepts. If you think about true belonging as self-acceptance being purely individualistic and belonging as being a group dynamic, there's something that's a little bit in between. And ultimately, our research found that there's 4 different types of belonging. There's foundational belonging, self-belonging, group belonging, and societal belonging. And this is a way to really evaluate and understand the current states of belonging today. And I wouldn't say that one type of belonging is more important than another. It's very much of like these types of belonging are interdependent and relational with each other and might ebb and flow and react to strengths or weaknesses in other types of belonging. So they're inherently intertwined.
We would imagine that you are working with a lot of places that haven't thought much about this on a collective level. Maybe individuals have thought much about this topic or they have experienced a lack of belonging, but it hasn't been addressed corporately. What's that cultural shift been like, and where do organizations begin? Is there some form of a litmus test? One of the things we've done in our Creating a Caring Culture training at Someone to Tell To is to literally carry a mirror with us and have everyone in the room take a good, hard look in the mirror, along with the question, how are you adding or detracting from the culture you wish to be a part of?
I love the visualization of that. Before I answer, I wanted to throw that back to you. Like, what's the litmus test for your work as Someone to Tell It To? Like, when is an organization ready to bring you in?
Well, we've worked with several different organizations. We do a lot of work in healthcare in particular. And we can think of some of the medical communities that we've worked with that there's been tension at times between, maybe direct staff, doctors and nurses from higher end administrators, because administrators tend to look a little bit more numbers focused and doctors and nurses tend to be a little bit more empathetic, compassionate, care focused. And there can be a little bit of a tension there between the two. And as a result, they have a hard time truly hearing one another. And it could create tension and a lack of belonging within the work culture. So we've worked with several healthcare communities where we're trying our best to help everyone truly listen to each other's perspectives. It's all about, as Brene would say, perspective taking, and how do they take the perspective of an administrator, if you're a doctor who is focused more on numbers to meet certain goals that they need to meet financially so that people have a job. But then on the flip side, how do CEOs work with their doctors and nurses to give them permission to give patients the kind of care that they need? So it's been fascinating. We've done a lot of work in healthcare, and it's been a common issue.
I think especially because we are about the work of listening. And so often, both the administrators and the practitioners aren't always in a space where they can listen well to one another. But there's also so there's there's a problem there. And there's also, particularly, I think there's certainly a growing understanding of the need to listen to the people for whom they serve, and to understand what it is they really need, what they're really looking for, what would really help their situation. And just so often, when they're, the job of record keeping and having to document and all of the administrative functions that need to happen, that that are mandated or they're required, it can detract from actually listening to one another and to the people who are being served, and therefore everyone is a bit unsatisfied, and sometimes a lot unsatisfied or dissatisfied. And that creates tension. So I think that the point at which we are often called in is because there's some sort of crisis. Mm-hmm. There's just a disconnect, and there's a realization that something's not working, and that the team is not functioning well. It's not functioning as a unit, is not appreciating or affirming of one another, and there's a realization that they're not perhaps getting the job done that they need to get done.
Yeah, we look forward to that. Yep.
Yeah, so that's often the case, and trying to one of the things we can try to do is help in those situations to bring together the different factions, so to speak, and have them hear one another, listen to one another as to from their various perspectives. It's not always easy, and sometimes it's painful, but it's also necessary.
For our listeners, we reference this mirror illustration that we've used periodically, and they've heard this story before, but I'm going to tell it again, where we were working with an organization, a healthcare organization locally here in central Pennsylvania, and we had wanted to come in, and when we run our caring culture training, we kind of think that what we offer works because it's proven to work in a culture if you actually allow us to come in and fully lead the training the way that we feel compelled to lead it. And we had come into an organization, and we had offered to meet initially with all the lower level staff, i.e. the practitioners, and then another meeting with the higher level staff of the administrators, and then bring the two parties together because there was severe conflict within the organization, and they wouldn't allow us to do that. And as a result, it just they were never able to truly work through their issues because they were in some ways kind of hiding things, I think, and they weren't really giving a good hard look in the mirror at themselves.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And I also have found that some of our less successful projects are because the client is unwilling to look at themselves in the mirror, so to speak, which I think is sometimes the unexpected outcome of our work is like, people will sometimes our clients are often bringing us in for a customer-centric challenge or like an organizational strategy challenge. But what they often do not anticipate is the level of self-challenge and self-work that is required to bring a strategy into fruition and even to solve the problem. So that's very relatable. I would say in regards to belonging in this specific work stream for shareholders, it's very much in progress. I would say belonging is still emergent and it's accelerating due to COVID-19 and all of the conversations that we've had over 2020 about racial justice and around loneliness and mental health. It's been really interesting because often, at least what I've seen over the past year, which again is like a very limited track record, that this is truly the amount of time in which, industry is changing and where this is emerging. Most organizations, I would say, their litmus test for talking about belonging is because there's been a major fracture. And they're talking about belonging in relationship to DEI. And certainly belonging is related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, though it's much more of an outcome of having a successful diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And there's many other elements within belonging as well. So belonging is, I would say, at an intersection of topic, but currently when organizations are ready to talk about belonging, it's because they've experienced something that is deeply uncomfortable. They've experienced and noticed a division within their team, and they're looking to heal it. I would say, however, you cannot address belonging within your organization without also addressing DEI. So really, like, you do need to prioritize DEI before you can even open that conversation. But I don't know if we're at the tipping point as like an industry yet. I would love to see more organizations approach belonging proactively. We have found in our research, out of the resulting frameworks that came out of it, which is an assessment tool for assessing the 4 different types of belonging, is that it's really helpful as a diagnostic tool of where to focus your energy and time going forward for building a culture of belonging. What's been interesting is, we're currently working on this project with a large company that is opening a new office campus in a new location. And it's been such an interesting experience being a fly on the wall in this project and being privy to these really interesting larger corporate strategy conversations. When they're talking about belonging, they're talking about belonging in the context of increasing their organizational success over the next 10 to 20 years. They're saying things like, we need to improve belonging for our employees because it impacts their mental health and their wellness and their ability to collaborate as a team. And that impacts their productivity, which impacts our P&L, which when it comes to talking about belonging in terms of profit and loss, like, it has like a very gut reaction to me. I'm like, oh, like, that's so cold and like, not the point of belonging. And to talk about belonging in the sense of a P&L and even to like advocate for belonging from a business case, it feels very dirty in some ways, because yes, like, there is a significant business case of belonging. In fact, one of the studies that we cited in our research was an article in HBR. The author is escaping me at the moment, but there's a really fantastic stat that a company investing in belonging can save up to $52 million per year for a team of 10,000 people due to an increase in productivity and a reduction in sick days and absenteeism and so on and so on. So there is a significant bottom line impact for belonging. However, when the emotional devastation of the lack of belonging in the human, when the emotional devastation is so strong and so extreme, and the human need is so high, it feels very crude to speak about belonging in that context. I think there's a lot more work to be done that can really create the business case for belonging. For example, like directly tying belonging to employee productivity, though sometimes I'm like, yes, we need that. And then other times I'm like, I don't even want to touch this topic because it feels so dirty. But that's the reality, is how some organizations, particularly large corporations, are thinking about belonging right now. They're thinking about it in terms of like the future of work, the future of society, and how they can win over not just like the next 1 year, but the next 20 years.
So we'd love for you to begin to answer your own question here. How does uncertainty impact one's sense of belonging at work?
The answer to that is really straightforward. Uncertainty magnifies existing experiences of belonging. We saw in our research that belonging did decrease with the onset of COVID-19 and the rapid shift to working from home. However, it did not decrease as significantly as we would have anticipated, that rather it was this larger existing experience of belonging that existed prior to COVID-19 that was being amplified. So if you felt that you had a really strong belonging experience prior to COVID-19 and this experience of uncertainty that we had in 2020, you probably still felt to some extent, or maybe even more so, an experience of belonging. But if you felt that you did not belong prior to COVID-19, you probably much more extremely feel that you do not belong now. So the experience of uncertainty that we all saw in COVID-19 really made it much more acute and highlighted how belonging at work falls short in general before COVID-19. And it helped us to understand the factors of belonging on a much deeper level and really articulate and define those 4 different types of belonging. So it just made things much more clear and much more strongly experienced.
We'll take a time out for a second and just note the fact that the sun is just glaring down on you through your apartment right now.
It is. It's actually reflecting from a window across the street.
Oh, really?
Like the sun is shining on a window and the window is like reflecting into my apartment.
Well, Well, in the middle of winter, we'll take all the sun we can
That's
get.
right.
Absolutely. Like, this is the magic hour.
Yeah. Well, well, in light of what you were just talking about with COVID and people feeling even perhaps like they belong less, with the distance and isolation and everything going on, have you learned some things about how to help alleviate that? What have you learned in relation to this additional stress that most people are under?
Yeah.
And how to achieve a greater sense of belonging in an organization?
I think that's a very worthy question. For the research that we conducted in 2020, it was more focused on understanding the landscape of belonging and how does belonging or how does uncertainty impact one's sense of belonging. So it wasn't as solution oriented as I might have preferred, though certainly there were indications in our research of what solutions might look like. From an organizational and company level, one of the big outcomes, and part of the reason why I was so excited to talk to the two of you, was that organizations really need to begin listening to their employees. They need to do this. Oh, my cat is joining our conversation now. I don't know if you can hear her.
We can.
I love those interruptions. Clark just mentioned, we actually were interviewed on another podcast just the other day, and it went live. And in the middle of that interview, I was interrupted several times with my kids running around through the room. And it's all part of the experience.
Anna Banana. She wants to say hi.
Nice.
I'm sorry, where were we?
You said that you identified some potential solutions.
Oh, yes. Well, of our research participants, some of them were very, very adamant that we can't just simply have like a checklist of like, you need to do 1, 2, 3 things to foster a culture of belonging. But one of the key recommendations that was consistent across all of our research participants was the effort of listening, which is why I was so excited to chat with your team, because listening is one of the most effective ways that you can begin to create and foster a culture of belonging. And not just listening on a superficial level, like with pulse check surveys that are really common in employee engagement metrics and employee engagement efforts, but really deep conversations to understand people's needs, and then taking those identified needs and taking action on them. So taking public accountability for what is learned in those conversations, and then co-developing solutions together. One of the models that came up in our research that was mentioned by one of our research participants was this concept of a citizen's ladder of engagement that's commonly used in community organizing and urban development models. And it's this idea that we need to move up the ladder of citizen participation, citizen engagement, from superficial passive listening, which is more of like tokenization, manipulation, towards co-creation. So listening and then co-building and building co-ownership over solutions that come out of that listening process, and sharing the responsibility and power in developing new solutions. And of course, like that's very abstract and on a high level, but that's like what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about building cultures of belonging is how do we listen? How do we identify solutions together? How do we make people part of the process and have co-ownership over this? And then beyond that, there's like some really simple tactical things, like when it comes to foundational belonging, which is really about acknowledging that you are a human being who contributes value by the mere fact of existing. It's understanding that people have lives outside of work, that they have children to take care of, that we're going through a really stressful time and someone might be experiencing increased anxiety right now. And just like providing the very basics of what we need to function as human beings, not just at work, but beyond work as well.
So this next question that we wanted to talk about, it's something we're really looking forward to talking about just because it's so relevant. In an article written by Kira M. Newman in September 28th, 2017, entitled, "How Do We Cultivate Belonging in a Culture That Is So Divided?" And she writes, "America is in the midst of a spiritual crisis of disconnection, and that's my opinion, but a finding from some of the latest research by social scientist Brené Brown. When Brown talks about a spiritual crisis, she's using a very specific definition of spirituality, one that emerged from the research behind her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. The recognition that we're all inextricably connected to each other through love and compassion. But according to Brown's research, people today feel they are losing that sense of shared humanity. She writes, "The world feels heartbroken to me right now," she writes. "We've sorted ourselves into factions based on our politics and ideology. We've turned away from one another and toward blame and rage. We're lonely and untethered and scared, so damn scared." Brene goes on to give 4 keys to true belonging, and she says, number 1, make contact with people you disagree with. 2, share collective joy and pain. 3, speak up nicely when you disagree. Number 4, embrace the paradox. So based on that article and from your research, what do you think about this idea of a spiritual crisis of disconnection? And what are your thoughts about Brené's list of ways to cultivate true belonging? Would there be anything you might add?
We are absolutely in a spiritual crisis. The day that we're recording this is January 7th. So yesterday was the coup when we were trying to certify Biden's election. Like if that is not the greatest example of the sense of disconnection and spiritual crisis that we're experiencing right now as a culture, I don't know what is. Like we are absolutely in a crisis moment, and that is reflected across all facets of culture. And I think it's really interesting. Like I absolutely agree with those 4 keys to true belonging that Brene mentions. And I'm a huge fan and advocate of her work. In fact, I recently completed her Dare to Lead training program.
I saw that in your bio.
It was amazing. I highly recommend it. She's been a huge source of inspiration, and certainly her models for working through shame and conflict have been really fascinating. Though I think it's been really interesting because our research presented an alternate perspective on belonging than Brené's. And I think this makes sense because our research was focused on the experience of belonging at work from the perspective of employees, whereas Brené Brown's work really is focused on leaders, people who are very actualized, who have built companies and are at the top of their game, so to speak. And in some regards, this idea of true belonging, which is focused solely on self-acceptance, and for like a lack of, I'm going to be blunt about this. I think it's a very privileged perspective. And I think that Brene actually would agree with that based on her more recent podcasts and even the updates that she's made to the Dare to Lead programming. Fully optimizing to belonging to yourself it's a highly individualistic venture, I would say. The reality is that we are inherently in relational environments, particularly when it comes to places like work, where you're accountable to delivering on a task and, getting along with your boss, getting along with your team. If I showed up at work and was like, you know what, I'm just totally gonna be myself today, whatever you guys need, I'm just gonna do my thing. And this is what I need from you. Like, that's not gonna work for the majority of people at work. Like, that's not, like, to say that you're optimizing for true belonging at work in a group environment like that it's a highly privileged perspective. And in some ways, like, I think that's really well epitomized in American culture right now. It's a hyper individualistic culture. So it makes sense that narrative has landed so well in a hyper individualistic American culture where we're optimizing for true belonging. But it's ideal that we find communities, and I don't want to say but there, I would say and it is ideal that we find communities and places of work where we are able to operate in a mode of true belonging and also are able to operate within the context of a group and a team as well. Like, ideally, both those things are true and optimized all the time, though that's not reality for most people, particularly for people with marginalized identities. And instead, I would say it's significantly more nuanced. So how can you create space for others to be themselves, especially if you're someone in a position of power, such as an employer or a manager of a team? How does your community or place of work support 4 different types of belonging, where people are seen, valued, and recognized for who they are and how they contribute, and people also know the value of what it is that they bring to the table, and you're creating opportunities for them to step into their own goals, into their own power, into the way in which they want to belong. So it's really much more of like a give and a take. And also beyond that, what does it mean to have fit within a team or within a community? What are like the specific attributes that you need within this group? Like whether it's that data science skill set, or it's someone who is really effective at listening, such as the two of you. Like what does it mean to fit within this group, and how do we attract people that are aligned with that? So it's much more of like a give and a take, and like a relational dynamic than what I believe true belonging really stands for. And I think that's a really interesting topic. Like I would love in my dream scenario to sit down with Renee at some point in time and have a really honest conversation about this.
Sure.
Because I think it's a really interesting tension, and I would love to see people talk about this more.
Well, if you get her attention, you let us know.
Yeah. In the work that you've been doing, what's been the most radical reshaping of a culture that you've seen? What had to occur for such a transformation to happen? I mean, can you give an example or examples of where you've seen that kind of reshaping?
Yeah, going back to the example I mentioned earlier of our work with the American Medical Association, I think that was a pretty radical reshaping of culture. In that project, we were brought in with this objective of reimagining physician engagement as members of the AMA. And I can remember in that project being nervous during our research, because a lot of our findings were related to the team dynamics and the culture of AMA, as opposed to purely like the outward facing engagement with physicians. And I remember being like, wow, like we were not hired to say this. This is a little bit outside the bounds of what they're expecting to hear from us. And I remember when we brought up the topic in our meeting, having like a bunch of nerves of being like, I don't know how people are going to react to this. But when we shared the insight that one of the greatest opportunities for them in terms of physician engagement was reimagining their own culture and sense of performance evaluation as a company, you could just see around the room, there was this sigh of relief of like, oh, somebody finally said it out loud. Like they'd all been feeling it. They had communicated it to us in different ways, and they were just like waiting for someone to officially name it and give them permission to call out that the way that they measured success as individuals and as a team was no longer working as an organization. So they really had to undergo this shift of evaluating performance based on activity, which is, not that really uncommon for many organizations. Like a lot of orgs are activity based, like I shipped X. But they're needed to move towards a culture of outcomes, which is when you're in relationship with people like your community members, it's really about that mutual value exchange of what is it that I can do for you, and how are you benefiting me, and how do we support each other in mutual success. And so in order to create that culture and community, they needed to become much more outcomes driven and measure their employee performance with outcomes. And that's just like one example. In some of our projects, it's much more personal in terms of transformation and how they're reshaping the culture. Like one project that's coming to mind for me at this moment is some work we did with a pop-up synagogue here in New York City called Lab Shul, which is a radical, God-optional, artist-driven synagogue that has a very diverse membership compared to the majority of synagogues. And I can remember in many of our conversations with their board undergoing this process of, like this reimagination of the future of our organization and how we're going to be in relationship with our members within this shul going forward. It's not about what I want as a board member. And just because, I am one of the highest donors and contributors to this organization, I'm not going to necessarily be able to prioritize my needs. I need to prioritize the needs of the community. And I think that was such a powerful transformation and transition for them to shift their perspective of me-centric to us and community, that was incredibly powerful. And I can remember like there was a couple of calls where like I almost cried because I was like, wow, this is very beautiful to witness this happening and to see that shift.
So on that point, could you get personal with us for a minute? And when and where have you felt as if you most belonged? How does listening intersect with belonging?
I think that's a very meta challenge for me. And, earlier I was listening to your conversation with Casley, and she mentioned this. She said something that really resonated with me, and that she was often the one that was listening to other people, and that she realized that no one was really listening to her. And I think that's very true for me. And I would say that's probably true for a lot of people who do this kind of work, is that we are attracted to this work because we have felt that we have not belonged, or we have lacked community, or have not been listened to, or we have felt our own social isolation. So that's something that I personally struggle with on a deep level, and it's something like I'm always wading through, and it's very much a case of like the cobbler's shoes. Yeah.
Hence the need to have those phone conversations that you had talked about earlier in this
I
program.
know. Yeah. But there are some places where I really do feel like I have deep belonging. One that's coming top of mind for me right now is I'm part of a design mastermind group that was started a few years ago, started by my friend Lauren. And I feel like I have like deep affinity for them. Like they've been such a great source of support for me over both COVID-19, but our careers generally. We started this group because there's not a lot of, initially we started it, I would say, because there's not a lot of female design leaders. There's many women who work in design, but the thought leaders are mostly men. Eventually we realized that like it's not just women, it's actually anybody with a marginalized identity, and we like sort of expanded that vision and mandate of the group. But it's very informally organized. I think as people who are constantly caretakers for others, all of us are sort of like exhausted when it comes to caretaking. So we've made a point to be very low key about the group. It's not very well formally organized. And I think even like the way in which we operate in that regards makes us all feel that we belong a little bit more, because we know that it's not because people do not care or they're not committed if like no one's sending out the notes or like updating the meeting invite. It's literally just that we all are taking care of so many people all the time. Yep. And that our job is to create space for others, that sometimes we just need to create a little bit of space for ourselves. And that's been a really interesting meta dynamic of the group. So I feel that I very much belong there.
We actually literally just had this conversation yesterday, just
really?
About being quote unquote professional listeners.
Yeah.
We can attend outside groups and it can become just another listening session for us, listening to a lot more people's problems, which we love to do. Don't get us wrong. I mean, that's what we feel very compelled to do each and every day. It's what gets us out of bed every morning. However, it can also be exhausting, and it's all about setting parameters and boundaries at times and knowing your limits. So
absolutely, that 100% resonates. And I think something that I've been personally working on over the past few years is actualizing that for myself, of making sure that I'm speaking up and saying what it is that I need when I come to the table, and not just listening. And that's been a really uncomfortable and difficult exercise for me, but I'm getting better at it.
Yeah, good for you.
Well, we understand that then too, and sometimes struggle.
The
same things. So I understand. We've got just a couple more questions before we close today. As we've talked about before, you've had training, in Brene Brown's work and in her research, and we want to talk about the training you've had on her research on shame, vulnerability, and empathy, and how you can put those things into practice for teams. We'd love for you to talk a little bit about the impact of each of those aspects on a team or a group: shame, vulnerability, and empathy.
Yeah. Brene says in her work that shame is what holds us back from vulnerability. There's like a lack of psychological safety, a fear of not just being of not just feeling that your behavior is bad, but that you are bad as a person. And that's how she defines shame. And when we activate or participate in shaming behaviors within teams and groups, and that could be something like the meeting that happens after the meeting, back channeling, interruption, gaslighting. She has like a whole list of types of shaming behaviors that show up within groups and teams at work, which, once you start seeing the list, you're like, oh, I've done that, or oh, I've experienced that. Like, they're very common workplace behaviors. And it makes you realize how common and all the different ways that shame shows up at work, and how people might even use shame as like a weapon in the workplace, which is very, very dangerous. But she would say that shaming behaviors create shields that we try to protect ourselves from shame, either by pushing against people, pushing them away, or sometimes like shutting down and withdrawing. And when we use and utilize those shields, whether it's from a self-protection mode or from an attack mode, that is the opposite of creating an environment of belonging. And that the more we're able to be vulnerable and show up with our full selves and with the awareness and like let go of shame, the more deeply we're able to belong.
Absolutely. And that's why we just have appreciated your work so much, because you're steeping yourself in a lot of the same messages and topics that we live and breathe each and every day.
Well, thank you for your work too. I was so excited to learn about Someone to Tell It To. I feel that your work is really needed right now.
So I get to ask the last question, and I'm excited about this. So we like to end our time together with another question about you personally. And I had referenced earlier about your biography and that you said you enjoy gardening, which we've talked about. But the other two, we'd like to just briefly talk about watercoloring and being present. You talked about the first one earlier, but could you talk about those other two and how those keep you emotionally and would say spiritually healthy?
Yeah, I mean, watercoloring is a way of being present, I would say. So maybe watercoloring, or maybe being present, is inclusive of watercoloring. Though I think for me, watercoloring is just something I picked up over this past summer. I wouldn't say I'm good at it, but I'm enjoying it. And it's just been a way to cope with the stress and anxiety of COVID and being isolated, and really just like a form of creative expression, which I think really closely ties in with the idea of self-belonging and feeling connected to myself. And the more present I can be, the more connected I feel to myself. So it's been a lot of watercoloring, but also long walks, a lot of staring at the wall. I've been taking a lot of baths, actually, which if you're not taking a bath during this period of time, I recommend doing one tonight. Fill up a tub with hot water and just sit in it, put your phone away, leave it in the other room, and just be present.
That sounds amazing.
You may be giving us ideas here.
Yeah, we actually we have a spiritual discipline, which I think we actually referenced in our interview with Casley, is we always read together. It's something we've done since we started Someone to Tell To almost 10 years ago. And we just literally ordered yesterday on our Kindles a book by Henry Thoreau, and it's entitled Walking. And it's only like 30 or 40 pages, but we've had some of our friends and donors who've recommended that we read it because we walk together, we process together. We were each other's someone to tell it to, hence the mission.
Someone to Tell It To was created, birthed on a walk we had together.
Wow, that's beautiful.
It's very appropriate, yeah.
That is very appropriate. I've definitely enjoyed taking walks with lots of friends during this period of time. The outdoor social distancing.
Well, thanks for answering that last question, because I know in Brené's podcast, which we also tune into pretty regularly, she often will end the conversation by asking the guest, what's something that you'll participate in that you'll just lose all sense of time? And we just love that question. And it sounds like watercoloring and being present is one of those ways for you.
Gardening.
Absolutely. Gardening for sure too. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, this has been so nice. What a way to spend our afternoon. So thank you
for having me. I really appreciate it.
And
so lovely to talk with you both, Tom and Michael.
this has been fun, and it's wonderful to meet you and to learn more about you and to connect and find the common things that we all share.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation today, because we certainly did. And as we end our time together, we want to give another call to action to each of you who have watched or listened today. The challenge is to understand more and more what it means to belong, what belonging is, and also, as Sarah talked about, what it isn't. We know that it is important for all of us, especially in this time in which we experience so much more disconnection, loneliness, and isolation. It's important to belong, to know that we have a community, whether it's a community of colleagues where we work, a community around us in our neighborhood, a community in our friends and our family members. And there's nothing better than to know that we belong. We're accepted, that we're loved, and we wish that for everyone today.
Well, we hope this conversation was inspiring and educational. We hope that, as we referenced in the interview, that maybe this is another opportunity for all of us to take a good hard look in that mirror to reflect back on our own lives and our interaction with others, and how we can be about the work of fostering true community and connection among our friends, our families, our coworkers, and everyone that we come in contact with. As we mentioned earlier, Dr. King was a man of action, and we can bring that action into our lives every day simply by lifting each other up and challenging inequality and hatred wherever we see it. So, until we listen again.